The morning they came to ruin her field, she was already standing at the fence. Dawn had barely broken over the creek timber, a thin gray light, the kind that gives no warmth, only visibility, and the wagon had come up the lane before most of Cooper County had set its breakfast fire. But word travels in a small place, the way frost travels across a window, quietly and all at once. And by the time the first ice block struck the ground, there were a dozen people gathered along the road, then 2 dozen. They came the way people come to a thing they expect to remember, not running, not loud, but steady, and with a particular stillness about the eyes. The wagon was loaded with the remnants of a winter's unsold cargo, blocks that had been cut from the pond in February, packed in rye straw, and left too long in a warm shed. They had gone soft at the edges, clouded through, and no ice house in 3 counties would take them at any price. The cost to haul them back to town, the merchant had decided, was more than he cared to spend. The field, he had also decided, would serve well enough instead. His crew worked without enthusiasm but without hesitation. 2 men to a block, iron tongs gripping the pitted surfaces, and each one heaved over the fence rail and dropped onto the lower meadow with a sound like a dropped stone. Heavy, definitive, sinking slowly into the April mud. The straw came with them. It spread across the seedbed in pale, wet clumps, and the water that ran from each block found the slope of the ground and moved. She watched from the fence line. She had her hands folded over the top rail in the manner of a woman watching weather, not resigned, not afraid, only present. She did not speak to the crew. She did not look at the crowd. If she had an opinion of what was happening to her field, she kept it somewhere behind her face, in the place where a person keeps the things they cannot afford to spend yet. The gathered crowd was not unkind, exactly. There were no cheers. A few of them looked at their boots. Clara Bett, who kept a sharp accounting of other people's misfortunes, stood near the road surveyor and said in a voice she intended to carry, "She ought to have taken the offer when she had the chance." The road surveyor said nothing. He watched the ice blocks settle into the furrows where her seedlings had been set the week before, and he looked, for a moment, like a man who was not proud of what he was witnessing. The merchant himself sat on the wagon box. He did not climb down. He watched his crew work, and he watched the woman at the fence, and eventually he looked away first. By the time the last block cleared the wagon bed, the meadow looked like a battlefield after a strange and quiet war. The straw, the pooling water, the cold seeping into ground that had only just begun to warm. She had not moved. She had not moved, and that stillness was not new to her. It had been 2 years in the making. 2 years since the fever took her husband in the November of 1875, 3 weeks before the first hard freeze, leaving her with the deed to 40 acres in Cooper County, a mule with a sore foreleg, $11 in a tin box, and a winter she would have to get through alone. The 40 acres were not a fortune. The upper ground was thin and stony, more suited to scrub oak than to wheat. But the lower meadow, those 6 acres of creek-bottom ground where the soil ran dark and heavy and held its moisture past the point where the upland fields had gone to dust, that was worth something. That was the thing the land had given her that no assessor's number could properly account for. She had learned the place the way you learn a difficult book, slowly, by returning to it. She walked the boundaries in the early mornings before the dew was off. She noted where the frost held longest in the hollow along the northeast edge of the meadow. She watched where the runoff went after a heavy rain, how it sheeted off the slope above and gathered in that low corner before it found its way to the creek. She did not know, in those first months, what she was learning. She knew only that the ground was telling her something she did not yet have the words for. Her ledger was thin, but it was honest. She had recorded every expense since her husband's death, with the care of a woman who understood that a mistake in arithmetic was not an abstraction, but a missed meal. Spring seed, 1877, $1.40. Corn came in poor that year, the summer too wet and the ears small, but it came in. Fall trade at the dry goods counter in town left her with $3 and some cents put aside. By the spring of 1878, before the trouble with the ice merchant began, her total reserves amounted to $14.60. Not nothing, not enough. The offer of $34 for the 6-acre lower meadow had arrived in February, written on a square of paper in a tight, commercial hand. She had read it twice, set it on the table, and gone back to her ledger. The offer was not entirely unreasonable as an accounting of the land's assessed value, and she understood that the man who made it knew figures well enough to know it was low. She wrote a one-sentence refusal and returned it the following morning. By the end of that week, the refusal was the talk of every dry goods counter in town. "She'll come around," they said. A woman alone, that much ground, that hard a winter ahead. They said it without malice. They said it the way people say things that seem obvious. They had not walked her boundary lines in the early morning. They had not read what the ground had been writing in that northeast hollow for 30 years. She had, and so she had refused. The ice finished its work by the second morning. What had arrived as a wagon load of spoiled cargo, half-melted blocks sweating through their straw packing, already unsellable, already lost to the merchant's ledger, completed its dissolution in the low April ground and left behind a meadow that looked less like a farm than like the bottom of a shallow lake. The meltwater had nowhere particular to go except down, and down it went, spreading flat across the 6 acres of creek-bottom ground, finding the soft channels between the seedling rows, filling them, smoothing them, erasing the careful geometry of her spring planting as a wet cloth erases chalk from a slate. She stood at the edge of it that second morning and did not cry. She recorded what she saw. Corn seedlings laid over, squash hills dispersed, kitchen garden rows indistinct. She wrote it in the ledger without embellishment, the way damage should be recorded, plainly, so it can be measured and answered. The town did not wait for her answer. Word of the soaking had moved faster than the meltwater itself. By the morning of the second day, it had already passed through the dry goods counter, where a woman named Clara Bett held a kind of unofficial court, dispensing news with the authority of someone who considers herself a keeper of accurate records. She was not a cruel woman. She simply spoke what she saw, or what she had heard about what others saw, or what seemed, given the circumstances, most likely to be true. And what seemed most likely, given a young widow alone on hard ground with a flooded meadow and a seed investment of $2.80, now standing in 4 inches of cold meltwater, was that the spring planting was finished before it had truly begun. "That lower meadow is drowned," she said to the woman beside her at the counter. "You won't grow corn in standing water. Anyone who farms knows that." The woman beside her nodded. She told 2 others. Those 2 told their husbands and their neighbors, and the clerk at the feed store. By nightfall, the assessment had the quality of something already settled. Not a prediction, but a conclusion. The widow on the creek bottom claim had refused a fair enough offer, and the land had answered for her. The planting was gone. The season was lost. She would come around in time, or she would not come around and would lose the claim to taxes, which was a harder thing but not, in these times, an unheard of thing. None of them had stood at the meadow's edge that morning and watched the water move. She had watched it for a long time, longer than was practical, longer than grief warranted, not mourning the seedlings, though they deserved mourning, watching the water. Watching the direction it chose without being asked, the way it cut a shallow line through the meadow's gentle eastward slope, the way it gathered in the northeast corner, filling the low hollow, settling and stilling and staying. It had not spread there. It had arrived. He came the next morning. She heard his boots on the frost-hardened path before she saw him, slow, deliberate, the measured tread of a man who has learned not to hurry ground that does not ask to be hurried. He was past 70, some said closer to 80, though he did not volunteer the number, and no one pressed him. He had come from Bohemia before the war with a wife, 2 oxen, and a sense of soil that could not be bought or taught, only carried across an ocean and set down carefully in new earth. The wife was gone now. The oxen were long gone. But the sense remained. She met him at the meadow's edge without preamble. Neither of them wasted words on the damage. What Voss's crew had done was visible enough. The straw still matted in long wet windows across the low ground, the seedling rows broken and submerged, the ruts from the wagon wheels already beginning to crust at their edges as the morning dried what the ice had left behind. It looked like ruin. She had looked at it all night, and she knew what it looked like. He walked it slowly, not the way a man walks a field he has given up on. The quick survey, the averted eye, the small commiserating shake of the head. He walked it the way she had watched him walk his own ground in dry years, low-shouldered, attentive, reading the tilt and texture of each small thing, as if the field were a letter written in a language that required patience to translate. He paused at the places where the water had moved, and crouched once to press 2 fingers into the soil, then lifted them and looked at the color they carried. She said nothing. She had learned this much from him already. That silence was not emptiness in a man like this, that it was where the thinking lived. He made his way to the northeast corner, to the low hollow she had watched all the previous evening. The water was still there. Not the frantic pooling of the melt's first hours, but something quieter and more deliberate, settled, leveled, held. The hollow had received it and kept it, the way a cup holds what is poured. He crouched at its edge, looked at the line the water had carved coming in, looked at the pitch of the ground from the meadow's center to this corner, sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, not to her particularly but not to himself either, in the way a man speaks when he is confirming something the ground has already told him. The ground tells you where water wants to go. You do not argue with it, you only follow. He stayed crouched there another moment. Then he straightened, unhurried, and looked at her. There was nothing dramatic in it. His eyes simply held a question, not whether she had heard, but whether she had understood what came next. She had. She walked back to the house ahead of him. Not quickly, there was no urgency in her stride, and she did not look back, but with the particular forward lean of a woman who has already decided and is only now catching up to the deciding. The old man did not follow her inside. He did not need to. He turned and walked the long way back across the meadow toward his own fence line, unhurried, the way a man walks when the conversation has already concluded. The ledger was open on the table when she sat down. She had kept it faithfully since her husband's death. Every transaction, every cost, every yield and shortfall entered in her own hand in the column she reserved for things that had already happened, and the column she reserved for things she was still owed. It was not a hopeful document. It was an honest one. She turned to the current page and read what she had already written there. Corn seed, squash, kitchen garden mixed, $2.80 total, purchased the 3rd week of March from the dry goods counter. Beside it, in the second column, the planted rows in the lower meadow, the expected yield, the arithmetic of what she needed to clear to carry through winter on anything better than bare subsistence. She left that column as it was and opened a new line beneath it. She wrote, Irrigation channel, hollow to upper terrace, approx 90 feet, grade to be set by hand level and twine. Labor, own. No dollar figure beside it. The cost would be her back and her hands, and the better part of 2 weeks she did not have to spare. She knew that already, and did not bother writing it down. What she wrote instead, in the margin, where she sometimes kept notes that were not quite numbers, was a single line. Seed already spent. No argument for caution. Only forward. She set the pen down and looked at the arithmetic for a long time. $2.80, gone into ground that a man had deliberately soaked through with rotten ice and spite. The hollow held what the melt had left. She had seen it with her own eyes, sitting quiet in the northeast corner through an entire afternoon and into the following morning, refusing to drain away. She had watched it, the way her husband had taught her to watch anything uncertain, long enough to know if it was behaving or only performing. It was behaving. The ground sloped to it naturally, as the old man's eyes had already confirmed, and the distance from that hollow to the upper terrace where her corn rows waited was nothing that a spade and a steady grade could not address. The question was not whether she could dig the ditch. She could. The question was whether she could dig it before the seedlings, already jostled and waterlogged, gave up entirely. She closed the ledger, pressed her palm flat against its cover for a moment, as if sealing what was inside. Then she went to find the spade. She was in the lower meadow before full light, while the ground still held its nighttime cold and the meltwater in the hollow lay perfectly still, dark as a hand mirror. She had studied the slope the evening before, walking it twice with her eyes low, trying to read what the old man had already read in a single unhurried glance. The ground dropped away from the hollow toward the northeast. She had felt it in her knees before she measured it, and then rose again, gently, toward the terrace where her corn rows ran in their careful lines. 90 feet, near enough. 90 feet of earth to be opened and persuaded. She drove the spade in at the hollow's edge and turned the first sod before the sun cleared the tree line. The work did not announce itself. It simply began, and then continued again, the next morning, and the one after that. She set the twine first, staking it at both ends and pulling it taut, then borrowing the hand level from the old man's barn, a brass-fitted instrument heavier than it looked, worn smooth along its top edge where decades of thumbs had rested. She sighted the grade in sections of 10 feet, adjusting the twine's height by half an inch, where the ground swelled unexpectedly, re-driving the stake when the soil was too loose to hold. The arithmetic of it was relentless. Drop enough to move water, not so much that the current tore the banks loose before summer had a chance to pack them firm. Mornings she dug. Afternoons she hauled the loosened earth back from the channel's edge with her hands and a flat board salvaged from the woodpile, building a low berm on the downhill side to hold the flow where she wanted it. Her palms blistered on the third day, and she wrapped them in strips of flour sack and kept going. The old man came on the 5th day. He walked the length of the twine without speaking, stopping 3 times to crouch and sight the grade with one eye closed, pressing 2 fingers into the turned earth to feel its density. When he reached the far stake, he straightened slowly, looked back along the line she had cut, and said only, "Good." He went home. She kept digging. He came again on the 11th day, when she was perhaps 15 feet from the terrace, and the channel had begun to look, in the flat morning light, like something the land itself had decided to produce. He stood at the upper end for a long time. Then he said, without turning, "You followed it." Not a question. She did not answer, because there was nothing to answer. She had followed it. The ground had told her, and she had not argued. By the 14th day, the spade broke through the last foot of earth at the terrace's edge. She set the blade down in the dirt and looked back along 90 feet of open channel, waiting now for only one thing. She walked back to the hollow. The pool had held through 2 weeks of digging, fed by whatever seep or subterranean patience lay beneath that northeast corner of the meadow. It was not deep, 4 inches at its center, perhaps 6 where the clay dipped lowest, but it had not shrunk. That was the thing. 10 days without rain, and it had not shrunk. She stood at its edge and looked at the channel she had cut, rising away from her in a shallow climbing line, and she thought about grade. She had borrowed the hand level again that morning, walked the full 90 feet checking each 8-foot section, adjusting twice where she had cut too steep. The twine still ran stake to stake, a straight authority above the turned earth. The arithmetic was right. She believed it was right. She took the spade and broke the thin lip of clay she had left at the hollow's lower edge, a small wall, barely the height of a boot sole, that had held the pool in place while she finished the upper end. She broke it in 3 strikes. Set the spade aside. The water found the channel. It did not rush. There was no force to it, no drama. It moved the way cold water moves when the land gives it only a little room and a little tilt, slowly, feeling its way, spreading first into the loose, disturbed soil at the channel's base, soaking in, then finding the packed clay beneath, and beginning, quietly, to travel. She walked alongside it. She did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The water was not hurrying. It took perhaps 20 minutes to cross the full 90 feet. She watched it the entire way, crouching twice where the grade flattened, to make sure it had not stalled, standing again when it continued. At the terrace's edge, the channel opened onto the first corn row, where she had cut a small earthen fan to spread the flow. The water reached the fan, spread across it in a thin sheet no deeper than a finger's width, and ran down between the 2 nearest rows, darkening the soil as it went. She watched until it reached the end of the row. Then she went inside. The ledger lay open on the table beside the window that faced the lower meadow. She had been keeping it since the first week of April. Seed costs, labor days, borrowed tools noted and returned. Her handwriting was small and even, each entry set out in the same spare accounting. She dipped the pen and wrote the date, and wrote, "Ditch carrying water to corn rows, first flow." Nothing more. She did not write that she had stood in the field for 20 minutes, following the progress of cold water through a channel she had cut with her own hands. She did not write what she had felt. The ledger was not the place for that. It was the place for what was true and measurable, and what was true and measurable was this: the date and the water and the corn rows waiting. She closed the ledger. Outside, the sky was pale and cloudless, and the month was nearly May. June came in dry. June came in dry. There was no single morning when the absence of rain became a fact. It crept in the way drought always does, quietly, by degrees, until the cracked skin of the road and the pale color of the sky made it plain that something had shifted and would not easily shift back. The creek dropped. The pasture grass went from green to the dull yellow-green of a bruise fading. By the middle of the month, a man could cross the creek at the lower ford without wetting his boot tops. She noticed. She adjusted. Each morning, before the sun had cleared the tree line to the east, she was at the head of the ditch with the short-handled spade, clearing any small collapse of soil, nudging the flow where it had wandered in the night. The water moved slowly at that hour, cold still from the hollow that fed it, and it found its way down the 90 feet of channel with the patient indifference of water everywhere. It did not hurry, and it did not stop. By the time the sun was high enough to press heat against the back of her neck, the corn rows had taken their morning drink, and the soil between them was dark a full hand's width to either side. She did not linger to admire it. There was always something else. July came harder. The sky in Cooper County turned the white blue of fired enamel. Cloudless, enormous, merciless. Wells dropped. A man 2 miles east lost his entire stand of rye in the space of 10 days. It simply went from struggling to finished, the stalks bending and then lying flat in the heat as if something had knocked them sideways. Clara Bett remarked at the dry goods counter that she had never seen corn tassels so early and mean, that the whole county looked as though God had set a flat iron on it and walked away. She was not wrong about the county. She was wrong about the 40 acres on the creek. On the upper terrace, the corn stood, not lush. This was not a season for lush, but upright, and green at the stalk, and putting out tassels that were not yet defeated. The kitchen garden behind the house had drawn from the same ditch via a short lateral she had cut in the second week of May, and it was producing, not extravagantly, but steadily, squash on the vine, beans climbing their poles, the small potato hills still dark and uncracked. She did not go into town to announce any of this. She kept the ledger, she kept the ditch clear, she rose before the heat and slept when the work permitted it, and the weeks moved forward the way weeks do, not quickly, not slowly, only forward. But others were watching. A drought does not stay private. It is a public fact, written in the color of every field a man rides past, and by the last week of July, there were fields in Cooper County that no longer needed any further commentary. Hers was not among them. Hendrik Voss owned 14 acres of rye on the high ground east of town, land that sat well above any creek and drained fast and had always been sufficient in ordinary years. This was not an ordinary year. By the middle of July, his rye had passed the point where hope was any longer useful. The stalks had gone from green to gray-green to a color that was not a color so much as an absence, the straw yellow of a field that has already decided it is finished, still standing, only because nothing has yet knocked it down. The heads were light. He could feel it when he walked the rows in the early morning, the way a man will sometimes walk a sick field, the way he might walk a sick room, quietly, not wanting to disturb what cannot be helped. The heads were light and the kernels small, and the ground beneath his boots had cracked into shapes like broken crockery, each piece curled at its edges and pulling away from its neighbor. He had watered nothing, because there was nothing to water it with. The land was high and the summer was dry, and that was the whole of the arithmetic. He rode past her lane on a Thursday in the third week of July. He did not stop. He did not slow the horse more than a man naturally slows when rounding a slight curve in a rutted road, when the ground is uneven and a careful driver gives his animal its head. But the lane opened as he passed, and the lower meadow was visible from the road, not hidden, not tucked away, and what was visible was green. Not the desperate pale green of a plant pushing its last strength into one more inch of growth, but the steady, purposeful green of corn that has drunk regularly and means to continue. The tassels were up. The stalks were upright. There was no drama to it. It simply was, the way a fact simply is. He did not look long. He kept the horse moving and was past the lane within a few seconds, and the road bent north, and the field disappeared behind the tree line, and that was that. He rode past again on the following Saturday. The county road surveyor, a methodical man named Elias Cobb, who marked grades and recorded right-of-ways, and made it his general business to observe the lay of land along every road in Cooper County, was working that Saturday at a stake he had set 3 weeks prior, checking the settlement of the grade near the creek crossing. He had a good memory for the ordinary patterns of the road, who rode it, how often, and at what pace. He noted the ice merchant's horse. He noted the slowing. He noted the direction of the man's gaze, down the lane and into the lower meadow, and the way he gathered the reins again and moved on without stopping. Cobb wrote nothing of it in his field notes. He did not need to. Some things keep well enough in the memory without being written down. The corn came up in July the way quiet things do, without announcement, without spectacle, 1 green inch at a time until the inches became a foot, and the foot became 2, and then the whole of the lower terrace held the color of deep summer, the way a held breath holds air, steady and full. The drought had settled in by the first week of June. It did not arrive with the theatrics of a storm. It arrived the way debt arrives. Gradually, then all at once, the creek dropping to a thin thread, the pasture grass bleaching from the roots, the sky a pale and remorseless blue day after day, with no variation, no cloud building to the west, nothing. Neighbors began to talk about it the way they talked about all hardships, with a practiced stoicism that masked the arithmetic they were doing privately, the counting of weeks against the counting of stores. Her ditch ran. That was the plain fact of it. The hollow had not failed, just as the old man had said it would not fail, and the water moved down the 90 feet of cut channel by the simple operation of grade and gravity and the willingness of the earth to keep its promise when properly asked. She walked the ditch each morning before the heat was full up, checking for silting, clearing a clod when one worked loose, adjusting the twine marker where the bank had softened. It was not dramatic work. It was the kind of work that looks like almost nothing from the outside, and is, in fact, everything. By early August, the corn stood waist-high. The surrounding land had gone the color of old straw by then, the same tired yellow-brown that covered every field from the creek road east to the county line, the same defeat written in the same faded hand across every acre that depended on rain that had not come and would not come. Against that backdrop, the lower meadow read like a different country. She was not there when the dry goods merchant's wife came past on the road. She was at the house, updating the ledger, recording the week's yield against the week's expenditure with the same patience she had given to the ditch and the seed and the grade of the channel. She did not see the buggy slow. She did not see the woman pull the horse to a full stop at the lane and sit there in the August heat, looking down into the lower meadow where the corn stood green and full in the dead brown afternoon, the kitchen garden dark and living beside it. The woman sat for a long time. She did not call out. She did not turn the buggy in. She looked at what she saw with the particular silence of someone who has said a thing with certainty and is now faced with the evidence that the certainty was wrong. Then she gathered her reins and moved on down the road without stopping, and said nothing to anyone that evening about what she had seen. He came in early September. The road had been dry for so long it had gone to powder, and his horse raised a pale ribbon of dust all the way up the lane before he came into view. She heard it from the garden. She did not go to the fence. She set her hoe against the post and waited where she stood. He rode slowly. That alone said something. A man who has the advantage does not ride slowly. He pulled up at the gate, and he held his hat in his hand rather than on his head, and he sat for a moment without speaking, as though he had rehearsed words that had now left him. He said he wanted to talk about the ditch. She said nothing. He said he had a rye field, the 12 acres on the east side of Birch Creek Road, and the ground had not seen useful rain since the middle of June, and the crop was finished. She already knew this. Every farm in Cooper County knew it. He said he had heard, and here he paused, arranging himself. He had heard that her ditch still ran. It did, she told him. It ran. He asked, quietly, if she would consider leasing water access. 1 season, a fair price. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and walked to the house. He waited at the gate. She came back with the ledger. She opened it on the fence post in front of him and found the page. She told him $11 for 1 season, the agreement set down in writing before 2 witnesses, and she would not discuss it further until the witnesses were present. He did not argue the price. She sent word to Ruth Pruitt, whose farm sat a quarter-mile north, and Ruth came within the half hour, still carrying her apron in one hand. The county road surveyor, Elias Cobb, was already on the property that afternoon. He had come to mark a boundary question on the upper corner of the claim, and she asked him to remain, and he agreed. She wrote the terms in the ledger herself, in her own hand. 1 season's lease of water rights from the irrigation ditch running through the lower meadow, $11, not transferable. The access point and hours were recorded. Both witnesses signed. Elias Cobb used his own pen. Voss signed last. She blotted the page. She closed the ledger. She accepted the $11 and recorded it immediately in the column on the right side of the page, next to the entry for the $2.80 in seed she had purchased in March, next to the entry for the $34 offer she had declined in the same week. The neighbors who had come down the road in April to watch his crew unload the wagon were the ones who saw him sign the paper on her porch. She offered no remark on this. The paper lay open on the porch railing for a moment before she folded it. A clean fold, once across, then once again, precise as the work that had preceded it. She slid it between the ledger's pages, not at the back, not set aside, but directly behind the entries it belonged to, flush against the numbers that told the whole of the story in figures rather than words. The witnesses stepped back. The neighbors who had drifted near, drawn by nothing more than proximity and the slow gravity of a September afternoon with little else to move toward, remained where they stood, hats in hand or arms crossed, watching a thing they had not expected to see and could not now unsee. The merchant stood at the far edge of the porch steps. He had already turned his hat brim twice through his fingers. He did not turn it again. She went inside. The screen door did not bang. It closed the way a well-set door closes when its hinges are true, with a small, certain sound that expects nothing further. On the lane, nobody spoke for a moment. The surveyor gathered his pen and his satchel. The neighbor from the north field folded her apron over her arm and looked at the meadow below, where the ditch ran on without ceremony, carrying its thin, bright line of water from the hollow in the northeast corner down to the kitchen garden and the corn rows beyond. The corn stood. It had stood all through July and all through August, while the ground across the county had tightened and cracked. It stood now in September's early cooling, dried to harvest gold at the tassel, full-eared, needing nothing further from the ditch that had sustained it. It had never required anyone's belief. It had required the grade of the ground, the angle of a hand level, 90 feet of careful digging, and the understanding that water will find its way if you follow where the ground says it wants to go. The merchant walked back to his horse. He mounted without looking at the meadow. Perhaps he had looked at it enough. The others moved off in their own directions, the way people do when there is nothing left to witness and no verdict left to render. The ditch ran on. A red-tailed hawk turned once above the lower field and angled south. The creek spoke in its low, late-summer register from the tree line, quieter than it had been in April, still present, still moving. Inside, she set the ledger on the table and opened it again. She ran her finger down the right-hand column, the column of receipts, until it rested on the newest figure, $11. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to the window. The lower meadow lay below in the afternoon light, green and still and undeniably her own. She closed the ledger. She went back to